Jihad, we can talk about the lesser jihad and the greater jihad. I think that I can certainly live with the greater jihad, where you're talking about, improving yourself within, becoming a more moral person, and so on, doing things for others. I can accept that. But the lesser jihad, which is the jihad of violence, is something that I can't accept. And I think that if you look at the life of Muhammad and some of the things that he did, and I could bring up, I could talk a lot about his relationship with the Jews, and that was the topic of my book. I think I came across that after studying this for at least 8 years before I started writing, that Muhammad was in the wrong in what he did to the Jews. Now I know that most of the things that were written in the early years of Islam were written by Muslims, like Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Sa'd and Waqidi. There's a bunch of them. The early writers of Muhammad told stories that made him really look pretty bad, but they were just trying to tell the truth about what they thought happened with Muhammad, and they got these stories from the Hadith. And the Hadith were the collections and sayings, the actions of Muhammad by his contemporaries. And what happened was that the first written biography of Muhammad was about 150 years after Muhammad's death. So what you had was that you had the companions of Muhammad telling these stories to people who told stories to another generation, until finally we get 4 or 5 generations and we have the first biography of Muhammad written. And they all told basically the same story, and the violent jihad was there. I mean, I don't see how you can read the Sirah, which is the biographies, the early biographies of Muhammad, and not say that he didn't use violence. And you talked about how this woman was killed, and I don't doubt that is in the history. I didn't get into the history of the Meccan period of Muhammad because my focus was on when he arrived in Medina in 630 or in 622. But anyway, those stories are there. And I could talk about a lot of stories, but we don't have time to do that. But there are 3 main Jewish tribes in Medina, and all 3 Jewish tribes, within 6 years' time, between 622 and 628, were either exiled, or the third group, the Qurayza Jews, were beheaded. There were about 600 to 900 people that were beheaded, and the Ishaq Ishaq was the first biographer, but he didn't really get his published. It was until after he died, a man by the name of Ibn Isham took Ishaq's work and put it into his story, into the first biography that was actually printed. And these stories tell the story of Muhammad leading raids on the Quraysh caravans. And they talked about taking booty from the caravans that were going to attack. So that was part of it. And then in every case of the 3 major Jewish tribes in Medina, the Muslim stories written by Muslim historians were that the Jews were wrong. The Jews they were being treacherous, they were liars, they were thieves, they were called all kinds of names, but the evidence didn't seem to back it up. What I came away from all the reading of the biographies is that Muhammad wanted to provoke the Quraysh into a war. He was a member of the Quraysh tribe in Medina, and he wanted to provoke them into a war. And that was part of the reason for the raids. The first 6 raids that they made on the Meccan caravans, the Quraysh caravans, were all unsuccessful. The seventh one, Muhammad gave a note to the leader of the caravan and said, look, I don't want you to read this note until you get close to Mecca, which is, they were going to raid a caravan on the outside of Mecca, the outskirts of Mecca. And he said, don't read it until we get far enough away that, and I'm not sure about the reason why he was not supposed to read this note to the other men, but that's what happened. But the men said, after his reading of this note, it basically said to attack this caravan around Nakhla. And this is in 623, about a year after Muhammad arrived in Medina. And this was the first successful raid. They actually killed a man on the caravan, and they took some booty and took it back up to Medina.
David, I'm going to have to move it along a little bit. Yeah.
I have a lot of other stories like that.
So I'm glad that there's a recognition that jihad isn't just the military, because I think that by itself is a big gain for understanding for people. The fact that David understands and has shared with people that there is the concept of greater jihad in Islam, which is the internal struggle with one's temptations, against one's temptations and for goodness. The lesser jihad, the military combat, when one is required to defend oneself. And this is obviously not individuals that can make such decisions. Individuals are always supposed to yield. In fact, the most honored, the Prophet peace and blessings upon him says, the most honored martyr that will ever be in paradise is a specific man named Hamza. And any person, man or woman, who stands up with a word of truth and is as a result killed out of persecution by such a system or such a ruler for standing up for truth. And so that by default means the individual isn't fighting back. But when there is a community that is trying to establish a pluralistic social order, which is certainly what Medina was by the testament. I know in your book in chapter 2 you contend that the Constitution of Medina existed, but the same exact sources which you're citing now for the fighting against the Jewish tribes are the same exact sources that confirm the Constitution of Medina, in addition to other sources. The Constitution of Medina was the first pluralistic living document for a city to have citizens of all faiths living together with freedom of choice, not only freedom of choice, but those that had governing laws for individual transactions for their social and family life that were based on their faith. They were allowed to have mediation based on that. And so they weren't then subjected to the laws of Muslims because of the fact that they believed in Islam. They were allowed to govern their locality based on what their consensus was. So Islam was this constitution of the Prophet gave social order based on a central governance, but also was very libertarian in that it pushed down governance down to the most localized of levels. But the fact that the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, and the companions committed raids on Quraysh has to be taken in the context of what did Quraysh do and what did Quraysh take. Were the Muslims committing raids where they were taking war spoils or war booty that was someone else's property? Or were they actually recovering their own property that was confiscated because of their faith when they were persecuted? Were they, in fact, and if we look at the historical books, both by Muslims like Ibn Hisham and Ibn Ishaq, like you said, as well as those who have examined sources back to the history, you'll find that there's no contention, and maybe the Meccan period will help shed light on that, because that's really when all of that persecution happened. So if we're starting analyzing the life of the Prophet with the point when he left for Medina, of course the conclusion you're making may be an honest one for just that time, because of the fact that you're taking completely, it's almost the same way that if we had ignored that Pearl Harbor was bombed, and then we said, you know what, the US was the aggressor against Japan. And if someone looks at the fact that we dropped an atomic bomb on 2 cities and wouldn't have looked at what provoked the US into war, it would be insanity to say that the US was actually doing the war as a type of defense. And I know there could be also contention still about World War II. But the point is that to look at only part of history and state that that's how we're deciding whether there was an aggression or not would be not wise. I think the wise thing to do is to look at what the Quraysh do. And Quraysh had in fact confiscated the property of the majority of people who had immigrated to Medina, except for very few of those Quraysh people who had believed in Islam, who had a very strong tribal protection that could stop Quraysh, the rest of the tribes of Quraysh, from taking their property, taking their homes. Other than those few rich elites that happened to accept the message of the Prophet, the majority and the rest of Muslims, their property, their homes, and in fact in some cases their families were taken. There's one case where one of the companions of the Prophet, Abu Salama, had to leave behind his wife and his child, and they were taken from him. The custody of his child was taken from him because he was a Muslim, and the maternal relatives of his son were not Muslim. This was the ultimate persecution. So what the Muslims were doing was recovering their own property. The second thing is that the quote-unquote war on the Jews, we cannot call it a war on the Jews, because if the Prophet, peace be upon him, was committing a war on faith, then there would no longer have been Jews in the peninsula, there would no longer have been Christians in the peninsula, there would no longer have been pagans in the peninsula after such a war. The Prophet was engaging in a consequence of treason against the tribe. It had nothing to do with their faith. The Prophet fought his own relatives the same exact way in defense, the same exact way that he fought the tribes that happened to be Jewish in Yathrib, or what became called Medina, in defense of this pluralistic constitution that was committed to by every tribe in Medina. And when one tribe committed treason against that constitution, then there was consequence, just like there would be consequence if a rebel group in America armed themselves and started wreaking havoc in a city, whether they were in Kentucky or Texas or in our own backyard in Indiana. There has to be consequence if the National Guard comes in and then the National Guard is forced to retaliate. And I'm not talking about against unarmed protesters in Baltimore or any other place. I'm talking about against armed rebellion. Then it would be considered justified by the National Guard if they were doing that in self-defense. And so the consequence of rebellion against the pluralistic constitution is what happened. It had nothing to do with the faith of those tribes. And it can be confirmed when you look at the rest of the history of Muslims. Never in the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish Peninsula's history, was there the flourishing of pluralistic joint faith community like there was during the time that Muslims were ruling the Spanish Peninsula. You had Jews that were in roles of power, Christians in roles of power, and Muslims in roles of power the same, and extensive scientific discovery, Cordoba, the finest university in the world. All of this because of the understanding that the Prophet Muhammad gave with that initial society form. And to conclude, that did not be understood by Muslims as that the faiths have a lesser role because of their faith. Of course, when it comes to theological discussion, a Muslim always contends that their faith understanding is the right one. That's conviction in faith. That has nothing to do with socio-political sphere where everyone has equal rights and it's protected, and it's jihad to protect the rights of every faith group.
All right, I'm going to have to move us along. Let's move into phase 3. This will be the final sort of discussion between the two of you before we move into some Q&A. So the issue is, how do we reconcile those verses? And David, I'll pose this to you now. How do we reconcile those verses in the Quran that seemingly do not promote tolerance and or coexistence with the verses in the Quran that seemingly do promote coexistence and cooperation?
Well, the verses of the Quran are broken down into two groups. There are the Meccan verses and then there are Medinan verses. And the distinction is when Muhammad lived in Mecca from 610 to 622, the verses that were coming to him from Allah were relatively peaceful. There wasn't a concern with using violent jihad. with the move to Medina, Muhammad, he went from being a preacher basically in Mecca, trying to get adherents to his faith. But then when he did leave Mecca, and he left it because there was a lot of conflict between he and the Meccans, and including the Meccans that were part of his own faith or his own tribe, the Quraysh. And there was a lot of dissension when he started talking about the revelations that he had received from Allah. A lot of dissension because the Quraysh and other tribes that lived in Mecca were very upset with what he was saying. He thought that they were criticizing their religion, which is what he was doing. He was saying, "Look, your religion is all screwed up. You know, you're actually worshiping many gods, and you know there's only one true God, and that's Allah, and that you need to recognize that." Mecca was at this time supposed to have been a city that was the crossroads of the Meccan trade between Yemen and Syria, and Muhammad himself actually worked on that trade, but he was very forceful in his condemnation of their way of life once he started receiving the revelations. And there was a lot of arguing back and forth. It came to a point at one time that his family was boycotted. There was a boycott against Muhammad. And so what it was, and I think that there was the two sides were, antagonistic toward one another. It wasn't just a one-sided thing. Muhammad was very antagonistic to them and really teed them off. And at the same time, they were kind of making fun of him and saying, "Look, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know that much about our faith," and so on. So there's that part of it that took place in Medina or in Mecca. But then when he finally leaves, because there were rumors out that he was going to be killed, he sent some of his people out back to Medina. And again, there's a lot more to this story than I can talk about right now. But he sent some of his people up to Medina because some of the tribes for the tribes that believed in polytheism, they were coming down for the yearly markets that they were having in Medina, and they listened to Muhammad talk. And some of them thought, we've got a lot of problems up here in Medina. So they invited Muhammad to come up and maybe be someone who could bring their community together. But then in talking with some of the other members of his family, his tribe, they were talking about, well, maybe we should do that. Maybe we should go up there. And someone said, well, you got to know what you're going to get into if you're going to follow this man, because and again, this was one of his relatives. He said something to the effect that he's going to bring a lot of violence and going to bring a lot of trouble. If you're going to follow this man, you better make sure you know what you're doing. But anyway, they get to Mecca, and well, that's what we lost my train of thought here.
Yeah, I want to kind of push you on that a little bit, David.
Okay.
If you could focus maybe on the text of the Quran and the juxtaposition of those emphases with coexistence or non-coexistence, cooperation, non-cooperation.
Okay, what it is here, I mean, I could come up with a lot of verses. Some people say there's well over 100 that deal with Allah commanding violent jihad. I don't know about the number. I mean, I found quite a bit in my study. But to the question dealing with this, how to reconcile them, I think that you can take surahs from from the Quran, and you can justify that, yes, it's a peaceful religion. And I'm not saying that all Muslims are not peaceful, but what I'm saying is that a good percentage of them are. And that the problem is that those who believe that the violent verses of the Quran and the violent sayings of Muhammad in the Hadith and what is brought out in the Sirah, those things are important to think of when you're talking about how to reconcile these two things, because they're really pretty hard to reconcile. Because there are people, it's not because this is the conclusion that I came to, it's just that there's a lot of Muslims, I'd say millions of Muslims in the world today, that believe what I am saying about the Quranic verses that advocate violence.
All right,
I think they're there.
I'm gonna let Omar respond.
Okay. And there we go.
So first, I want to agree with David that without proper faith understanding, it is easy to take the verses, and it is being done by Muslims around the world to justify socio-political objectives, to use those verses and to use.
Can I just say one thing, just very quickly? This is my whole point, and I'll be quiet. Actually, it's not what I believe. It's what I think, and I think what I really think I know is that the people who I call supremacist Muslims that believe that they have the answer to the questions for the world, and they're going to force it on people, they exist. And they are the ones that are creating all the havoc in the world today.
All right,
and they do this in the name of Islam. So that's my whole point.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that what Omar believes or what I believe. It's what they believe, and they are serious, and they say they're doing it in the name of Islam.
Excuse
me,
I think
David, if you're going to,
I think we need to let Omar have his time.
Okay, but
thank you. In fairness,
that's fair, but I'll reiterate what David is trying to say, just in fairness to him. So I think what he's trying to say is that the Muslims around the world do exist that are using the verses, and what I think David's contention is, and it's clear that that's, and correct me if I'm wrong, so I'm sort of giving you my time to reiterate what you're saying. Your contention in your book, your contention in your articles is basically that Islam has a problem. And Glenn Beck has a book today, Islam is the problem. Ayaan Hirsi Ali says Islam has in it a problem. This is the contention that a lot of our neighbors, a lot of our peers are scratching their heads wondering, Islam has a problem. Guys, abandon the problem with Islam and you're good. And the problem with that is that when we say that to the world's Muslims, what we're saying is basically you have to choose between the side that says we're going to abandon part of the faith because of the fact that it's being adulterated by part of the world. You have to abandon it altogether. Not try to understand it properly the way the Prophet Muhammad taught, but abandon it altogether. Or you will be like them. That's basically the choice being presented to Muslims. And so, you really want to say something?
I think we know that's true.
But so we'll have a chance there to answer the question. But the challenge with that choice is that it is actually what creates further the crisis. It enhances the crisis for our world and for Muslims. The real solution is literacy, faith literacy, back to what the Prophet Muhammad truly represented, peace and blessings upon him. Because anyone who spends even a superficial study of the seerah, and I'm not saying you didn't do this, David, so I don't want people to think that what I'm saying is that David didn't do more than the superficial study of the seerah. What I'm saying is that it's very easy, with what's going on in the world, with what some Muslims in the world are doing in the name of the faith, and with what many outlets are stating is being proven that Islam must be guiding them to that. It's very easy to read verses of the Quran without a study of the seerah, the life of the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him. Not by reading Ibn Hisham, but by understanding the context. You said you focused on Medina. Understanding the context of the world at the time. The world was an imperial, militarized world, where when anyone came, you're right, he ticked them off because he was saying, look, you can't bury your daughters anymore. He was saying, look, you can't treat your women like property anymore. He was saying all of the things that we would, if any of us were alive at that time, we would either fight with him, or we wouldn't really be standing for the values that we say we stand for today. And so the reality is that yes, he ticked the status quo off, just like Jesus, peace upon him, ticked the status quo off. Just like prophets in general ticked the status quo off. That doesn't mean they were aggressors. They came to tick the status quo off so that they can awaken the status quo back to God. That's why Christians believe Jesus was crucified. We don't believe he was crucified, we believe he was saved from the cross. But that is why he was attacked, because he ticked the status quo off. So ticking the status quo off is not something that's against Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, for all those who believe in God in the last day. It's something that's on his side. The second thing, and I will try to conclude with this so that we can have another chance. The second thing is that the verses in the Quran, again, have to do with context. The verses in the Quran that are supporting the defense of those who are persecuted are very clearly overwhelmed by the number and the volume of verses that teach how you live in a pluralistic society, how you give equal opportunity to all, how you protect the rights of those who are not Muslim. To give an example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, God does not prevent you from those who have never fought you in faith. That not only أَن تَبَرُّوهُمْ وَتُقْسِطُوا إِلَيْهِمْ. This word bir, tabarruhum, is used for only one other group in the Quran, and that's for children to their parents. So God says that you give bir, meaning you give the best treatment possible to those who are of other faith groups, but that have never persecuted you and tried to kill you for your faith, never taken away your freedom of choice. The second thing, that God says, are you going, if God willed, all the people would be believers, are you then going to coerce them to believe? Meaning, he's basically condemning for anyone to even have the thought of coercion. Also in the Quran he says, لا إكراه في الدين قد تبين الرشد من الغي. And that ayah, by any studier of the Quran, overwhelmingly abrogates anything that would negate it in the Quran. And abrogates means it comes ahead of, because in it is a clear description of one of God's attributes. When an ayah, when a verse in the Quran has a description of God's attributes, and I don't have a bachelor's in Islamic studies. I took this in the very first course that I took towards a bachelor's, which I haven't finished.
I'm going to cut you off.
Sure. Which is that if a verse has in it an attribute of God, it cannot be abrogated, because it has in it an attribute of God. So that verse cannot be abrogated. So no compulsion in religion is the stated rule for the rest of time.
Okay, David, why don't you take 2 minutes to respond. If you two are ready to do a kind of closing argument, I'm only going to give you 3 minutes because we're already after 6 o'clock, which means the audience won't get enough time to